But as Heather McGhee put in one spot in her book, the plutocrats have always known that solidarity is the answer, that the sum of us can accomplish far more than just some of us. That's why the forces seeking to keep the economic rules exactly as they are aim to cut off any sense of empathy white people who are struggling might develop for also struggling people of color. And we'll talk a lot about that tonight, about how we begin to get that empathy, but also the reasons behind that lack of empathy. So the second thing we want to say is that rural communities, as you all know, are not all white. Some are predominantly white. Some actually have a very strong mix of African American, Latino, Native American folks. But it's the case that even communities like where I am in Central Appalachia that have been overwhelmingly white are beginning to diversify with new generations of new Americans. And beyond that, we've also found that the working class is not also entirely the same. As Karen Nussbaum, who started Working America, put it, we found that about 1/3 of the people we talk to are already with us. 1/3 will never be with us. Working America, therefore, concentrates its organizing efforts on the 1/3 in the middle who are open to persuasion. So keep that in mind when we talk tonight about the steps we can take, and next week even more so, to begin to win back rural voters and working class voters of all races. We're talking about that persuadable group of roughly 1/3, according to Karen Nussbaum. Andrew Levison has cut that cake just a little bit different and divided the working class into what he calls cultural traditionalists, and that would be very applicable to many of my neighbors and probably many of yours, people with still an open mind, perhaps a little bit off-put by some of the changes, but not completely closed, and contradicting them with the extremists who are essentially beyond reach. And also noticing that within the working class, we tend to think of the working class as being white, when in fact, there are higher proportions of Hispanic and African Americans that are in the working class. So let's jump in. How did we get here? We're going to look at a number of underlying causes to the rural-urban divide. And the very first of those is that the economy hasn't worked for most Americans, the bottom 80%. So that's most of us. It's been stagnant wages, job loss, and probably the most enduring feature, economic insecurity. A lot of debt, a lot of uncertainty for themselves, ourselves, and the next generation. That economic insecurity, those stagnant wages, are especially high in communities of color and rural communities. So there's been this concentration of wealth. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of a struggle with the cursors here. There's been this concentration of wealth. We, since Ronald Reagan, have talked about a trickle-down economy, but in fact, it's been exactly the opposite. It's been a suck-up economy where wealth has been sucked up from workers to owners to capitalists, from Black households to white, from small mom and pop and family farms to the biggest corporations, basically from Main Street to Wall Street. And part of that concentration of wealth, that sucking up of wealth, has also been from rural to urban and suburban. And it isn't recent. It's been going on long before Trump, the better part of 40 years before Trump. Of course, his Tax Cuts and Jobs Act made things worse with the huge cuts in the top marginal tax rate and corporate tax rates. But it's been going on, including through 16 years of Democratic presidents. So while none of us at Ruby would say the parties are basically the same, there's no difference between Dems and Republicans, we don't think that for one moment. We do think that we have to own our own mistakes, historically and current, our own role in this mess. And there's a number of very specific and devastating things that have contributed to the economic problems of the working class and rural people, like the elimination of the Glass-Steagall Act that happened under Bill Clinton's leadership, which opened up Wall Street to all kinds of shenanigans and which almost sunk the economy, stole billions of dollars of wealth from middle class and working people. Or Bill Clinton's joining the Republicans to champion NAFTA, which has had profoundly negative impacts in most rural communities and small towns. And during President Obama's years, even though he himself spoke out against corporate consolidation, his staff, his administration basically let mergers proceed, including with Big Pharma. So we have to own our own role in this. This wealth concentration that's been so extreme in our economy hits rural communities even harder. And that's because rural economies are considerably less diverse than urban and suburban. There's much more likelihood that a rural economy is going to be dependent on one or two big employers or dependent on one or two economic industries and sectors. And so when that consolidation happens, when they shut down plants, when they send jobs offshore, rural communities are devastated from corporations like Tyson. But it isn't just in agriculture where the impact is felt in rural communities, because the reality is that for the last 40 years, most major traditional rural industries have seen dramatic losses in businesses and jobs. Timber industry, the coal mining industry, furniture, textile, many of them have either closed, been absorbed by big corporations, or been offshored. This concentration of wealth is seen in many parts of the country, but one example of it is in the industrial Midwest, where median household income today is lower in more than half of the counties in the industrial Midwest than it was in 1980, a staggering fact. Today, farmer debt compared to their income is higher than it's been in 3 decades, more debt to income than in 3 decades. And of course, the job loss due to NAFTA and other trade policies likely approaches at least 500,000 in places like Southside Virginia and many other parts of the country. So this economic betrayal, this economic transition that has devastated so many rural communities, this suck-up economy, is the number one and the foundational underlying cause of the divide. And it then has spawned and sort of justified or encouraged many other elements that have contributed to the divide. The second of these is the very common, widespread sense that rural people have of being neglected and being betrayed, particularly towards an elite group. Now, we might define the elites as a small group of the super rich that pull the strings. But in the countryside, among working folks, while there's not a lot of fondness for the super wealthy or the corporate CEOs, they really define elites as city people, as liberals and Democrats and progressives, as environmentalists, as intellectuals. So us, in a nutshell. And that anger is directed at those elites, and it has fostered what Kathy Kramer has called a politics of resentment. A fine book. You almost can't understand the divide without reading Kathy Kramer's The Politics of Resentment. A lot of stuff in that book, but she speaks about a rural consciousness and that perception among rural people that we in the countryside are not getting our fair share, not of money, not of resources, not of decision-making power. Now, another element of this rural consciousness that is both good and bad, but certainly has positive elements, is the strong identification to place, to their town, to their community. This is stronger in general among rural people than it is among urban and suburban folks who tend to be more mobile. So Kathy, at one point in her book, talks about the interplay between racism, which is clearly part of the divide, and other factors. Racism's part of this resentment, she says, but we're failing to fully understand the perspectives when we assume that racism is more fundamental than calculations of injustice. She's referring here to the sense that many rural people have, the very legitimate sense that they too are getting screwed, that they're not being treated fairly or justly. Kathy says the two elements are intertwined. The way these folks described the world to me, their basic concern was that people like them in places like theirs were overlooked and disrespected. And Kathy was referring to people in about 24 rural communities in Wisconsin, where she took about 5 years to do her research. Now, another element of this anti-elitism has increasingly become sort of a skepticism, if not a negativity towards so-called experts. And often on our side, liberals and Democrats will ask, what is wrong? Why won't these people listen to the experts? Well, there's a lot of reasons behind that, but one of them is that the experts aren't always right. One example, and there's quite a few of them, is that Bill Clinton and his Treasury Secretary, Robert Rubin, promised that NAFTA would create 1 million net new jobs over the first 5 years. And it had exactly the opposite impact in most small towns and rural communities. Gwen Johnson, who lives in Eastern Kentucky, not far from me, she was asked in an interview why so many people in her part of the world weren't getting vaccinated. And she said, OxyContin. We were told that OxyContin was perfectly safe and not addictive. The doctors and pharmacists told us, the government regulators said it was okay. It devastated our communities. So some folks don't trust the experts on vaccines either. So our point here is that, like a lot of other things, while the anti-expertise may be exaggerated, it may certainly be cultivated by the right-wing media, there are also some good reasons for some of that hesitation. And one more element of this rural consciousness that Kathy speaks to, and we've heard other folks from Ruby talk about as well, is just how critical work is in the identity of many rural people, critical to the values and identity. This attachment to work, this sense that hard work in particular is something people are proud of because it enables them to care for themselves and their families, but also they see it as a contribution to their community. And it's strongly favored by rural people over promoting what they believe to be handouts. So when we talk about government programs taking care of people, that's not a winning message with a lot of rural people because they see work as fundamental to their identity. On our side, we have folks like Harvard professor Daniel Markovits, who in his book about meritocracy classifies throughout the entire book all working class jobs as gloomy. Now imagine the millions and millions of working class Americans to have their work classified as gloomy, as unrewarding, as unimportant. The third underlying cause is a strong resistance to government in general, really an anti-government stance now, but particularly towards regulations, environmental regulations at the top of the list. Now, this is, of course, really unfortunate. It's also really ironic because rural people's lives are much more directly and intimately connected to the environment. We all are connected to the environment. We all depend on a healthy ecosystem. But fishermen, farmers, foresters, foragers, et cetera, so many rural occupations depend on a healthy ecosystem. And yet, so many rural people, in my own experience and in many others, have what I've come to call regulatory aversion, a belief that regulations are usually unnecessary, they're intrusive, and anyway, they don't help the little guy. So there's a number of reasons for this, but we're going to hit two real quickly. The first is that sometimes regulations just don't work. 12 years ago in southern West Virginia, an A.T. Massey mine, the Upper Big Branch mine, exploded, killing 29 miners. Now, in the year prior to that explosion, the Massey mine was cited for safety violations over 500 times by state regulators, 500. In the month prior to the explosion, they received over 60 safety citations, and yet nothing changed. 29 miners were killed, families in the community devastated. What do you think those folks think about regulations? It didn't help them one lick because of a lack of enforcement. And another dimension to this is that, and Kathy Kramer talks about this in her book, and I've experienced it many times in rural Appalachia, is that a lot of times people with great ideas, solid experience, and terrific knowledge are simply dismissed and overlooked. Bren Smith, in this picture, a guy who quit high school at 15 and fished commercially for 25 years, over the last decade has created this remarkable ecologically friendly system of raising shellfish called vertical ocean farming, utilizing seaweed to sequester huge amounts of carbon while cleaning up the marine environment. But Bran, like so many rural experts, wasn't consulted about his knowledge. So we tend to overlook that, and that lack of respect, that lack of sense that maybe these folks in rural communities actually know something of value, that really also cultivates that resentment of outside experts. Sorry, I'm struggling to get the cursor to move us along here. It jumps from 1 to 2. The fourth underlying cause is the feeling that many people have of being strangers in their own land, as Arlie Hochschild called it. Arlie, like Kathy Kramer, is a founding member of Ruby. And in her book, Strangers in Their Own Land, she documents the experience she had meeting with about a dozen rural Louisiana families for over a period of 5 years, much like Kathy Kramer did in Wisconsin. And what she found was this sense of being replaced or passed by. People felt that they were stuck in line, that they were doing what they were supposed to do. They were playing by the rules, they were working hard, but they weren't getting anywhere. In fact, oftentimes they were falling back further in line. And what the right wing has been so expert at doing is convincing a lot of these folks that the reason they're falling in line is because of immigrants or because of women or because of people of color. So this misplaced grievance towards those people, but it's based in a real sense that they themselves have been treading water. And so, as Arlie says, there's really not much positive to just classify that sense of being left behind as nothing but white privilege, when in fact, many of those people feel anything but privileged. We've seen this in other places as well. There was a very extensive focus group study done by the Democracy Corps early in 2021, a little more than a year ago. And they focused on working class folks, including in rural and small town people. And one of their conclusions, as discussed by Andrew Levison, was that while Democrats envision a progressive future America as being an exciting place, culturally and ethnically diverse, white working class and small town people imagine an elitist society in which they have no place. And Levison says, that might seem strange to you, but to understand it, you only have to consider how rarely small town life or the jobs, the manual labor of small town life are portrayed positively. In fact, they're often dissed and dismissed and sneered at. The fifth underlying cause, and I'm going to be wrapping up here and turning it over to Cynthia shortly, is how we, as liberals, progressives, Democrats, have too often played right into this narrative of being elites who don't care about working people or folks in the countryside. And the first part of this shift has been a shift away from the working class. A lot of folks, including Thomas Frank, have said the Democratic Party has moved from being a party of the working class to a party of the professional class. And one bit of evidence for that is Larry Summers, who was prominent in both the Clinton and Obama White Houses, admitting, in his words, that displaced white workers, displaced by NAFTA, by Democratic policies, weren't heavily on our radar screen, noting instead that the Democratic Party base is a coalition of cosmopolitan elite and diversity. And this playing into that anti-elite narrative, that sense that we don't care about everyday folks, has also been in our embrace of what a number of researchers and authors are now calling an excess embrace of meritocracy. Now, that's been something that really has been an American value for a number of generations, but it's become central to the identity of the modern Democratic Party. And what that has done, when people like Hillary Clinton, one of the most prominent Democrats, is in the company of, very comfortably, with folks like Bill Gates, it sends a message to many of the working class folks that they'll never be there and that the party has left them behind. The way we see this is that at the national level, now this will vary obviously at the state and local party level, but at the national level, the Democratic Party has shifted to a party that's culturally and socially quite liberal. And that's been a trend that's been going on for a long time, and one that we welcome and support on all kinds of cultural and social issues. But simultaneous with becoming more liberal on cultural and social issues, we've become more neoliberal on trade, tax, and economic issues, more like the Republicans of old. So while neither party has done much to help small towns and rural communities, to help working class folks, one party, the Republicans, speaks to and even foments the anger they feel, recognizes it. Whereas we've tended until very recently to just dismiss that anger or ignore it as having any base of legitimacy. And this has really cultivated this one party rule that we see across most of rural America. So I'm going to wrap up my part here in a couple more slides. And with this one, I'll wrap up. We have a lot of evidence that the Democratic Party has enormous problems in rural communities, and I'm sure you all know this, but just a few little tidbits. The 2021 elections, where Virginia lost control of statewide offices. In those elections last fall, 44 counties in the state went 70% or more for Glenn Youngkin, the Republican at the top of the ticket. Just 10 years earlier, only 4 counties went 40% or more for the Republican at the top of the ticket. That's a 11-fold increase. Across working class voters, all working class voters in the country, the support for Democrats has slipped steadily and substantially from about 40% in 2008, Obama's first election year, to just 33% in 2020, even though the working class makes up more than 60% of voters, or at least they did in the 2020 election. And among working class voters of color, we know we've been losing white working class voters of color, but we've been losing working class voters of color as well. So that the Democrats have lost about 18 percentage points among these voters of color over the last few election cycles, with Latinos the most prominent. So I'm going to stop at this point and turn it over to my colleague, Cynthia Wallace, who's the founder and executive director of New Rural Project. She's going to give us a very ground level view of some of these trends in rural North Carolina. Cynthia.
All righty. Thank you so much, Anthony. Once again, I'm Cynthia Wallace. It's a pleasure to be here with you all and to share space with Erica and Anthony for our second round, I think, of these. Though they've been working together quite a bit. As Anthony mentioned, I am the co-founder and executive director of the New Rural Project, founded about 14, 15 months ago with a good friend, Helen Probst Mills, where we both ran for office in North Carolina in 2020. And we are focusing our work as we start this rural focus work. And one of the things I do agree with Anthony is that folks do feel much left behind. They do in rural places. And our work, as you can see on the map, is centered in 7 North Carolina counties that border South Carolina. And we are a little bit more, I know working class is a broad group of people. And you'll see in the next couple of slides, similar to what Anthony was talking about, but how we've seen folks kind of shifting their party affiliation over these last 4 cycles. And as he mentioned, a lot of these things definitely didn't happen overnight, and they didn't happen, in one election cycle. So I'm trying to get my screen to move. There we go. And so as I showed you there, these are the 7 counties that we are working in. And so you'll see the next few slides will be focused on them. But we definitely feel very comfortable that these are a microcosm of counties across rural North Carolina, but rural America. And as Anthony mentioned earlier as well, rural doesn't mean white, though it has kind of sometimes in some sectors felt synonymous to that. 4 of the counties that we're looking at here are actually already majority minority. Robinson County is 70% Black, Hispanic, and Native American right now today. So this first couple slides just going to walk you through kind of how things have changed over the last 4 presidential cycles in terms of party affiliation. And I think similar to what Anthony was kind of sharing, I will walk you through, and these pages are going to be very much demographically based. And so just to make sure you're all grounded on what you'll see in the next couple of pages is that, these pie charts, red represents the percentage of registered voters that are registered Republicans, blue registered Democrats, and green registered unaffiliated, which in North Carolina means independent, basically. And it shows you how that has changed over the last 4 presidential cycles. This one is no surprise. I think it lends itself to some of what Anthony was sharing. As you can see, that red part of the pie is getting bigger, and that green part is also getting bigger, which means there are more people that are registering as independent. But there's definitely a shrinkage of people in these rural counties, white voters that are affiliated themselves with the Democratic Party. The next slide is very comparable. You'll see, no surprise, these are African Americans. Still a significant portion of them identify as Democrats, so that blue has actually stayed pretty solid. But that independence registration, that has definitely changed, gone from 10 to 16% over these 4 years, with a slight shrinkage in those that are registering as a Republican. So I think that's the other piece as we talk about what's happening. I think there is some shifting, but a lot of it is shifting more away probably from the Democratic Party in this particular sector versus going towards Republican. All right, this next one is looking at Native Americans. So in our 7 counties, this is actually our 3rd largest demographic. And what you will see with this population is probably a very dramatic change and a more dramatic reduction in that blue section. Those that classify themselves or registered as Democrats. So all of that loss is going to not only to independent, but it's definitely also going to those who are now seeing themselves in the Republican Party quite a bit more than they did just 12 years ago, or a little more than 12 years ago. And then this last one looks at how those demographics look with our Hispanic voters. So comparable to what we saw in the African American population, you will see that blue section getting just a little bit smaller. What you actually see here, though, is where most of their change and their shift is coming from is from being registered Republican. And actually more of them have been registering as independent over these last, those 12 years between presidential cycles. So that's kind of how people are thinking about themselves. So those changes don't always get reflected in how people vote. And so we'll see that in the next slide. And so it's taking a second to register. So apologize. Clicking the page.
I'm sorry, Cynthia. I'd given screen share over to Erica. I'm going to advance it for you.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll just tell you when I want to go to the next one. So as we talked about party affiliation, but the next couple of slides, it talks about how actually people turn out to vote. And it's split into 2 populations. And this is, where we've probably seen the most distinction between voter turnout, those over 40 and those under 40. And so similar, hopefully these arrows help you see all this data. My background is math and stats, so I do a lot of numbers, but I am a nonprofit leader right now. So as you can see on the left, these are similar to the previous pages where we'll see white, Black, Native American, and Hispanic all separated. And then those same 4 presidential cycles. And this shows you the percent of voters who turned out as a percent of those who were registered to vote. So as we see in that first chart, and we'll see it in all of them, we saw a dip from 2008, which was probably a pretty big high for most populations, and then a little dip in 2012, and in most cases, a dip in 2016, and a rebound in some cases in 2020. So white voters saw a significant jump, their highest voter turnout rate in the 2020 election. Same thing in that third chart with our Native Americans. And, and I always kind of, when people say it was a historic year for, our voting, it necessarily wasn't historic for everyone. Though on this page, you will see, even for Black voters, while they saw a dip in 2016, comparable to people, probably not being as enthusiastic about either candidate, they did see a good rebound in 2020. But unfortunately, the Hispanic folks above 40, actually their historic high was in 2020, in 2008. And so you'll see probably, a lot of little bit more stark information on this next slide. So if you could get to the next slide, please, Lauren. So you'll see a little bit more red on this page. So once again, it's those same 4 presidential cycles. This is 18 to 40. White younger voters, that's what we call younger, did see that dip in 16 and 12, but saw a pretty good rebound. Same thing with Native Americans. They actually saw their highest turnout in that 2020 election. But African American, 18 to 40-year-olds, and Hispanics on the other end saw a cratering of their turnout from their highs in 2008 and 2012. African Americans in the 18 to 40-year-old range were actually the highest voter turnout in 2008. And now they're towards the bottom. And so that really informs a lot of our work. And I know this is something that we're not only seeing here, but we're seeing this across the country. And basically, we've got some concern about how those younger folks are feeling connected to this act of voting and civic engagement. And you can go to the next one, Lauren. So what do all these things mean in terms of a real election? So these are those same counties we just talked about that you've seen that shifting in white voters away from the Democratic Party, as well as those Native American voters, and then a little bit more going into independent for Black and Hispanic. And then you've seen that cratering in turnout for those 18 to 40-year-olds, as well as some in those over 40 in the Black and Hispanic population. Well, those two things combined is how you get a result like this page. This is Elaine Marshall. She's Secretary of State of North Carolina. She was on the ballot these same 4 election cycles. These are full state elections, so it's not a product of gerrymandering. In 2008 and 2012, she was getting over 70% of the vote in these counties. As those party affiliations have changed, as the voter turnout has cratered in populations that were high turnouts in 2008, 2012, you see the result in 2020, which means that she barely won these counties. And if we took these counties apart, she actually lost some of these counties that she was winning well above 70. She did still win her seat, but by a much narrower margin because of these shifts and those things that we're talking about. Now we will say, and I know Anthony and you can go to the next slide. And Eric and I've had a lot of conversation about how, what the reasons are probably different based on where you're at and who you're talking to. But one of the things our organization, we always talk about our work begins and ends with listening. And in that listening vein, we've done focus groups. We've actually just finished some polling of these voters of color specifically. And that's our focus, are those Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks. And how do we increase their turnout and bring them back to places closer to where they used to be in 8 and 12? And this is just a little bit of what we've heard from them about what they think about their elected officials. They feel like they just don't hear from them. They don't see them. Unless it's right, like a couple of weeks before an election, a month or two. They don't like all of the internal debate within parties. They really just want to see some action. And they don't need these humongous outcomes. They really don't need the, furthest thing that somewhere can go or the elected officials can go. They just want to see some results and get some things done. And then finally, what was also interesting is when things are delivered on, they have no idea who's actually doing them when they're good things, unless they talk about it, and they really got to communicate better who actually is bringing those benefits and those things that they actually do enjoy and that are changing their lives. So you'll see in the next weeks, I hope you come back, how we're actually responding to the few pages I've just walked through at the New Rule Project. And I'll turn it over from there. I'll turn it over to my good friend, Erica, who's wrote an exciting book, Beyond Contempt, and have her walk you through some of her other thoughts on this rural urban bridge and divide.
All righty. Thanks, Cynthia. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for being here tonight. So Anthony's talked about how over the past 40 years or so, liberals and Democrats have come to be more oriented toward the interest of highly educated urban professionals. And what I'm going to do in this segment here is talk about how that elitist orientation is showing up in the way liberals talk about working people and about rural America, flyover country, as it's sometimes called, or as the Washington Post calls it. If I can advance my slide. There we go. The country's dank backwaters. I'm going to begin by showing you a few examples of liberals scolding and ridiculing people that they think they're better than. And I'm just going to run through this set without any commentary because I think they really speak for themselves. But as you're watching them, just see if you can put yourself in the shoes of the people who are on the receiving end and think about how that would feel. So what happens when people are treated with this kind of contempt is that they feel shame and anger and they get defensive because being verbally attacked triggers the same fight or flight reflex in the brain that being physically attacked does. The brain is preoccupied with protecting the person from the attack, and then the higher level regions of the brain that are responsible for empathy and reasoning, they just shut down because the person is totally preoccupied with defending themselves. And so no learning is possible at that point because the person either just wants to get away or to retaliate. And one way to retaliate is just to stubbornly refuse to budge because you're like, oh, I'm not going to give that person who's being a jerk the satisfaction of persuading me of something. And then the other way of retaliating is even worse. It's revenge seeking. This is why that humiliation is considered the nuclear bomb of the emotions, because it makes the humiliated person want to lash back tenfold or find someone like Trump who will do it for them. So this is what defensive looks like. And Trump knows this. What humiliation entrepreneurs like Trump are really good at is forming an us versus them bond against people who seem to despise them. He knows that if he can make people feel vindicated instead of ashamed, that they will love him. That is a key part of his cult of personality. And it's why I think insulting him is a major backfire, because it makes him look like a victim in the eyes of people who relate to having their intelligence insulted by the same people. There was an article in the Atlantic magazine about blue collar Trump supporters. And the reporter interviewed this one Ohio steelworker named Jack, who was the president of his local union. And Jack said that he found Trump's insults exhilarating because they were a kind of revenge. And then he said, it's a mirror of the way they see us. And so I want to point out in this picture that Jack is protesting a lockout at his factory. And this brings up another very big problem that I see with treating people with disdain, which is that very often it is class-based. It's punching down at working people, especially rural working people, some of whom tend to be more culturally conservative, but can still be progressive on bread and butter issues. But when liberals get in the habit of casting them and writing them off as deplorables, then this can become an excuse for not meeting their material needs and not caring if they lose their jobs, if they lose their farms, if their factories close down, if their hospital shuts down. So if we act like we don't care about them, then why would they vote for us? And I'm saying we here a lot, and I include myself as someone who's been a part of the problem, but I don't want to make any assumptions about what people at this training may have done or not done. So just wanted to put that caveat out there. The next thing I want to show you is a comment I came across from a New York Times reader that I think pretty well captures what a lot of people who aren't part of the ultra progressive left are feeling. I'm an old FDR Democrat. Whenever I try to talk politics with my progressive friends and relatives, I am met with a sneering laugh, openly derisive and dismissive of anyone so stupid that they do not see the virtue of unlimited illegal immigration, questions the recent orthodoxy that there is no such thing as male and female, or tries to explain that condescending contempt is a poor way to garner votes. These are highly educated people. One is a senior professor of sociology, another a Pulitzer-winning author, another a distinguished lawyer. The laugh is always the same, as if they practice it together, a nearly hysterical giggle of embarrassment that anyone could be so stupid. I am made to feel as if I am mentally deficient, and they can't wait to change the subject to end the embarrassment of being in the presence of a knuckle-dragging Neanderthal. Just imagine how a conservative reacts to this treatment. So this FDR Democrat is probably a swing voter, just the kind of person we have to be careful not to antagonize, because swing voters make or break most elections, especially in rural areas. We cannot afford to be losing swing voters. And you know, if they have views, really conservative views, such that they are not going to be with us, like if they're fundamentally opposed to our values and policies, that's one thing. And there's not much we can do. But if we are losing them because we're acting condescending and self-righteous, then that's our bad. And there is something we can do about that. I'm going to show you one more quote. This is from an Iowa school teacher who was asked why she thought rural Iowa voters swung from Obama to Trump. And she said, I think maybe part of it is we feel like they're telling us that if you don't believe in abortion, that you hate women. And if you like guns, then you just want kids in school killed. And so I think a lot of people felt almost attacked for beliefs that they have. And so people on the fence, like myself, that could go either way a lot of times, feel that a lot of times liberals think that they're the moral ones and they're right. It's like if you have a stance on certain issues that you can't be a part of us because you're so wrong on this issue. You have to believe these things or you're a bad person. So I see this habit of treating moderates and conservatives with this kind of disdain as a huge unforced error for the left that is costing us way more voters than it's gaining us. And it's fueling the polarization that keeps rural and urban America divided and is keeping a lot of people in rural America still wanting someone like Trump to defend their honor. There was a sociologist who talked to laid off steelworkers in Dundalk, Maryland. And he said that a lot of them were former Democrats who switched to Trump as soon as Trump started talking about tariffs, steel tariffs, even though they knew that the tariffs probably weren't going to work. But when Trump talked about tariffs, it made them feel like a politician was finally paying attention to them. And then this is what the sociologist concluded. Trump's masterstroke was to recognize the desperation of the white working class over the deteriorating industrial economy and to encourage their tendency to racialize that desperation. So I'm going to leave it there for now, and I will be back next week to talk about how we can get from here to here. And it's back to you, Anthony.
We're really finished at this point, and we just want to open it up to your comments and questions. We will be back next week, and hope all of you will as well. And folks who weren't able to be there, be here tonight, could watch the first half video and then still join us next week. Basically, there's a lot of options of what we can do to begin to shift this narrative and change this trajectory. Messaging is a key part of it, but it's not everything. It really begins with a rebuilding of trust by showing respect. And that's where we'll be putting a lot of focus next week. So we can stop the screen share now and just open it up to your questions and comments. We have a relatively small group, so you can either put your comment in the chat and we can read it, or Laura can read it, or because we're a smaller group, it'd be fine too if you want to just raise your hand, unmute yourself and ask your question. We'll just ask you to be as concise as you can so we can get the maximum number of folks in. While we're waiting on questions, I see one in the chat box from Mary asking, how do we get them to stop listening to Tucker? So that's a tough one. One piece of this that Ruby is not focused on, but is dealing with a little bit, is how to begin to compete a bit on the media front. The right has been blowing us away for years now with much more sustained and much better media than us, not just Fox News and Breitbart, but countless other sources. So part of it is we need to dramatically improve what we're offering through the media. And I won't go into it, but one group that's doing that and has been doing it for quite some time, I'll recommend to you, is called the Public News Service, PNS. Fabulous group that packages short radio stories based on current events, linking local issues with national issues from a progressive bent without being conspicuous or ideological. That's a great resource. But I think fundamentally, Tucker has appeal to so many people for the same reason Trump does. Tucker, like Trump, is a rich kid. Tucker's somebody that doesn't know the first thing about financial struggle or how difficult it is to get food on the table. Never has and never will. But he talks a good game. He's excellent at it, and he's sustained in his criticism of this elite Democrat liberal culture that doesn't care about you, the viewer. And our antidote to that, we can't shut Tucker up, is to start demonstrating over and over from the local level to our national leaders that in fact we prioritize working people.
I'm going to just add one thing to that, which is that, I mean, Tucker Carlson is like a huge problem, clearly, but not everyone watches Tucker Carlson. Like, I think sometimes we assume, you know, like 100% of TVs in rural America are tuned in, you know, except for me, Cynthia and Anthony and Lauren, are tuned into Fox News every night. And that's just not the case. And so, like, for example, Working America specifically has a program where they are targeting voters who do not watch any cable news. And these are people who might listen to local radio, local newspaper. A lot of people still read their local newspapers, and local newspapers, even conservative ones, are desperate for content and will sometimes even run liberal content. You'd be surprised. So I think we just have to work every other channel and not just kind of like surrender to like, oh, everyone's watching Tucker. Oh no.
I will agree with that, Erica. And you know, that local paper in rural places is still critical, even if it's, you know, gotten smaller and they've lost staff. Um, you can submit, and we do work with local papers on our events, and they're definitely not all liberal papers, but they will write verbatim your press releases because they need content. And so they don't necessarily parse it, you know, and so you got, because there are people like what our premise of the New Rural Project is, that we're definitely losing people because of the shift, but we're also losing people because they just feel neglected and not necessarily demeaned, but they just feel like no one cares about them at all. And so by hopefully creating and showing them there are other folks that are out there that do care about your issues and concerns, other than the far right, that it will bring some of these folks back to the table. And so we've seen a lot of them just leave the table, but that using your local paper and being in it is definitely critical. I have a friend in one of the more rural towns, counties out further east, and she was doing a column, and they let her do a column, and she was definitely liberal. And so they allowed her different perspective to be published multiple times in papers that get carried across the counties. And that's the other thing in these local papers. They're usually not just one county, at least here in North Carolina. There's one owner that owns multiple papers. And so they'll show the same article across multiple counties. And so we definitely need to work those places and leverage those places that the word gets out to kind of, hate to say real folks, but regular folks.
I see a comment in the chat about rural communities and candidates tending to not come visit them as often or be avoided. And I was curious if you all have any recommendations on that or validation of that.
Yeah, it's true. And
Cynthia,
stop
you have a good
avoiding,
example.
our advice is stop avoiding rural communities. I think a lot of Democrats who aren't themselves in that county, maybe it's a congressional district that has a sizable urban population, or maybe it's a senatorial candidate, they've just given up on the rural. They just think it's pointless. And that's that talk about something that is a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's exactly what we've been saying for a decade or two. And sure enough, it's becoming increasingly pointless because we've been ignoring rural communities. So I think the showing up by itself doesn't solve the problem, but the showing up is one absolutely critical element. You can't begin to rebuild relationships and trust if you're absent. If you're absent, they can think the worst of you.
And I think that showing up though, Anthony, I think it is a huge part of it. You know, and that's, I think, the thing that Trump and the Republicans have done so well. Like, you know, in North Carolina, Trump didn't go to Charlotte. He went to these smaller secondary counties, you know, smaller next level and even lower level. Robinson County, which was on that chart, had never had a presidential visit ever. Donald Trump came to Robinson County and he swept that area. And the other piece is what happens once again, kind of that local paper. And look, I think most folks here are from rural places. I was born and raised in small town. Most of my family still lives that way. And he came to one county and the word spread. And people from those other counties also attended. And so that's showing up without, like, even not hearing the rhetoric, just shows on the face of it, you actually care and you see them. And my example, I think that Erica was saying, in North Carolina, Chief Justice, former Chief Justice Sherry Beasley, lost her statewide race by 401 votes out of 5 million cast. Every single one of our 7 counties, simply with voters of color who did not show up to vote, could have covered that 401 vote difference. And so that's what we're really seeing in this, at least in some of these populations. They feel totally neglected and forgotten about. And our parties in these big campaigns totally overlook them. They don't show up. And by not showing up, that signifies you don't care about me.
In the chat, we had a question from Doug for you, Cynthia, about what reason did the 18 to 30-year-olds give for not voting in 2020 as they did in 2008?
So definitely some of it is obviously there was a pretty charismatic candidate who, got people involved. But I think one of the things I'll just say, just outside of what they said, what actually happened. So I was new to North Carolina when President Obama ran his first race. I've been here now 16 years. And their campaign was very smart about the local politics. Like they are how I got involved with the precinct, was from President Obama's campaign in an email. And so I think that also has kind of happened, is that we've gotten separated from the smallest denomination of potential activists. And I got involved in 2008 and never left. And then 12 years later, I'm running for Congress and never thought I would have. Part of it started from that email with President Obama inviting me, President Obama, quote unquote, inviting me to a precinct meeting. So I think we've gotten away from that lowest level of involvement that can spur folks to do other things and get more engaged. And I think there is definitely several things. I think some of what Anthony said is that I think folks probably feel a few broken promises. I think they thought life was going to change dramatically in 2008, and that hasn't happened. And so I think there is some disappointment in that. But obviously we know how, things take, unfortunately, a very long time in a democracy. Things don't change overnight. So I think that's part of it. Also, the arguing and bickering, a lot of times folks don't separate it from who's responsible for it. It just feels like chaos. And it is something that just has turned a lot of them off of all of it. They say, oh, it's all of them. They're all bad. They're all, always arguing and bickering and, and it just, mixes into a hodgepodge of, the sameness. And we'll talk more about it next week. But one of the things that no one's talking to them, back to what we were talking about, I actually have a new example. I'm probably not going to change it, but I'll just throw out, like, there's a young man in his 30s, over 1 month, came to one event we had, learned about boards and commissions, and a month later is now on his planning and zoning board in a rural county in his 30s. He didn't even know that existed and how he could get involved. So we've got to listen and talk, listen, number one, and then talk to these folks. No one's talking to them.
I saw another question about advice on engaging with evangelical churchgoers where their ministers reinforce conservative ideas.
So one, and a lot of these questions are pointing in the direction of where we'll be focused next week. So I'm delighted that you're asking them, because if you want the kind of fuller discussion, definitely come back. But one thing we'll be recommending, that we do recommend, is don't try to persuade them out of their conservative theology or even the political implications of their conservative theology, but instead look for opportunities to work with them to solve problems in your community. We have an example in our area where a local, very large, and most of our churches are tiny, we're in the country, but a very large, very evangelical church, it does real good stuff, but is very conservative, teamed up with the health department and with a couple of liberal sort of social justice-y type groups to make their premises and their volunteers available to set up vaccine clinics. And because they were a conservative group, they had sort of creds with a lot of the people in the community that were otherwise maybe a little bit skeptical about the vaccines. That was a natural sort of alliance that did a really important thing in the community, and it brought together these conservative evangelicals with atheists and agnostics and liberal Episcopalians and the whole spectrum towards a common goal in the community. So our most basic recommendation is, don't start with debate and persuasion. Start with action. Start with concrete stuff that you can do together. Maybe if you do enough of those things over time, those relationships will get to the point that then you can debate then you can argue, then you can persuade.
Ditto. That's literally the premise of how the New Rule Project started. We didn't start for registering voters. We didn't start talking about elections. We started talking about disparities in health and how do we reduce inequities in health. And I had recently, someone said to me, they said, "You work with that church?" And I'm like, yeah, we had multiple events with them, and I see the preacher and I hug him. And it's because we did not start about politics. And so I think that that's 100%, like, don't start at the point of division, start on a place where you can, commonly work together. And then you may be changing some hearts and minds.
Mhm.
You're not so bad.
Right. And even if it's not the hearts and minds of the members of that church, I think there's a lot to be said just for bringing down the temperature of partisan animosity in rural communities, because it's definitely not helping us that, we're trying to like appeal to people who are potentially persuadable, but our party has like this such a toxic brand right now. People are picking up from their neighbors like, oh yeah, the Democrats, they're so awful. So I think just generally among anyone, even people who will never vote for us, to the extent that they no longer hate us, that is all to the good.
One other piece of that gets to another question in the chat box from Farima, which is that we tend to have conversations in the abstract and wants to know how to get specific. That's a piece of this as well. I mean, the work together that Cynthia facilitates in her community, the example I gave, that's part of it. But also our language does tend to be up here. We tend to speak too much, and we'll talk about this next week, and too abstractly. And most people, but certainly country people, they want concreteness. The whole abstraction seems like we don't know what we're talking about, or we're trying to pull the wool over their eyes. So my rule of thumb in my own efforts politically is to always try to link some issue. If I'm trying to move people or open a conversation on some big issue, I always try to find a small local handle. When we had 25 years ago, a big debate raging about tobacco and a lot of effort to shut down the tobacco companies and all that came out of that, important stuff that needed to happen. The conversations we led in our community weren't about tobacco harming people or their health or the environment, all of which was true. It was talking to farmers about what could they raise, what could they produce other than tobacco and still make a decent living. We made it very concrete, very tangible for them. And then the conversation around tobacco's threat to public health was less threatening once they had alternatives to tobacco for livelihood. So I think that concreteness, always look, if you can, and find a local example of the issue you want to confront.
Well, I did see another question about the Hispanic vote in the chat and whether reasons that it has been switching is similar to what was talked about earlier.
There's
Is it a
people are-
decline in terms of turnout? Is that if that's the question?
The
and
question.
they're voting more Republican. Republicans capturing a bigger and bigger percentage. I mean, I know this is like a very intensely studied phenomena right now, because it's pretty major and getting worse with each election. So I'm certainly not an expert. I would say that from what I've read and sort of my gut on this is, I think Latinos are the most working class of any ethnicity in this country. And so to the extent that Democrats are losing working class in general, it's like not surprising that would also mean losing a lot of Latino voters. And then I think there's also a subset of that that's very religious in anti-abortion. And just like a lot of white Christians are voting based on being anti-abortion, some Latinos do as well.
I think that definitely it's part of it. There is probably a religious bent. And also one thing was interesting, and I'm definitely not an expert as well, so we're bringing those folks on to help us there. But when we started some of our work last year, and we had a Hispanic recently naturalized citizen that became part of our volunteer, and she spoke Spanish, and she made our vaccines so approachable. But one of the things we were working on our focus groups, and I sent her a note and said, hey, we want to make sure we ask, what do people think about local leaders that are Hispanic, like questions for our Hispanic, focus group. And her response was, there are not a lot of Hispanic leaders. And if you think, and I had never thought about like African American, because of the history of the civil rights movement, et cetera, even if people say we don't have the same leaders, there still are natural figures. And in the community, there are a lot of elected officials that are African American, or historically they were. And so you've got people to point to. And she literally said, and I think she was right. And I talked to other folks and they were like, I don't have names to give you. And so I think then that means that if there's a vacuum of people and then there are folks that are filling that vacuum and, showing up, like one of the things that the RNC is doing right now is they're putting these community centers in all of these places you would not expect to see them. Not the local Republican Party, but the national Republican Party. In Robinson County, that is 40% Native American, 30% African American. They have one of their community centers. So they're also showing up and then being in their communities, which is something I know Ruby wants to do a lot. Like really that model we think is what, is also going to change. And that's what the New Rule Project is focused on, is 365 days a year being in relationship and conversation with folks and not flying in for a few months before an election. And then basically what we hear from people is, oh yeah, then I never see them again. And then they come back 2 years later or 4 years later.
I have not seen any other questions in the chat. Well, actually, Mary Clark was just asking about what about running as an independent, and I'm curious y'all's answer on that too.
It's a tricky thing because our system is set up in most cases to really make that improbable. I ran for Congress twice in Virginia's 9th district, which is overwhelmingly red at this point, didn't used to be. And the second time I ran, which was a more serious run in 2018, I seriously considered running as an independent. Partly because I don't agree with everything about the Democratic Party. It was legit, but partly because of the toxic brand. And leading Democrats, who ended up being some of my most important supporters, told me, if you do that, we'll make sure there's a Democrat candidate and we won't support you. Even though we personally think you are by far the best candidate we could have running against this incumbent, but we won't support you if you go the independent route. So it's really tough unless you can finagle something behind the scenes to get the Democratic Party not to put up a candidate against you, and in essence be the Democratic candidate while being, in a titular sense, independent. I think in most places it's impossible. You're between a rock and a hard place, which is terribly unfortunate, but I think it's the reality in most of the places I'm familiar with.
Great. Well, I know that we were nearing time. Anthony, Erica, Cynthia, would you like us to solicit some more questions, or we can conclude?
I think there's a question about union.
I'm fine to stay a little longer.
Yeah, I'm happy to stay another few minutes. Yeah.
Then I do
people want
think
to.
a question about unions would be, the question in the chat was, we've talked about unions and union members. In your opinion, where did Democrats go wrong there?
I had a little exchange with Jim about that. I said, I think it's NAFTA. Jim said, but that was 20 years ago. Yes. Oh, sorry, you can't all see that. That was a direct message. So I did a little research on this for my book, and I found that, even though NAFTA was a while ago, it still played a really, really big role with a lot of union households, particularly in the Midwest, to the point where there was like, I think the Iron Workers Union or something had like signs welcoming Trump, like as the union, right? And Trump was doing things like one of his genius lines was when he did rallies in Ohio in like close down factory towns in Ohio, he would say to the people at the rally, no, every time you walk by that factory that's closed, just remember the Clintons did that to you. So it's just like the mileage out of NAFTA never ended. And we had at Ruby a couple months ago, a briefing from this guy, what was his name, Anthony? Richard Martin wrote this book called, wrote a report called Factory Towns, which was like a county by county analysis that correlated like the job loss in a lot of these deindustrialized Midwestern towns with like Obama to Trump flips in vote. And it was just like almost entirely, those blue collar voters or people, in those communities who were impacted by the factory closures. So sorry, was a very long answer, which Anthony, keeps telling me I need to get my rural creds and be more brief. That was a long way of saying I think NAFTA still is a really big deal.
And I'll just add to that, NAFTA is still huge, but it's more than just NAFTA. Now think about some really prominent Dems. Think about Bezos, Amazon, totally anti-union company. So it's maybe guilt by association in that case. Nobody in the Democratic Party is officially endorsing his anti-union position, but there's a lot of prominent liberals who are known to be liberals who have run tech firms or other companies that are markedly anti-union. And beyond that, the Democratic Party hasn't always led the charge, but they've been too passive in not fighting changes in the laws. The laws have changed over the last 30 years to make it much harder to start a union, much easier for companies to send posts and facilitate anti-union messaging, much harder to penalize owners when they penalize workers, firing them or sanctioning them. So the laws have shifted to simply make it on the shop floor much harder to form a union than it used to be. And like I say, Dems haven't generally led the charge on that, but neither have they necessarily vigorously fought that. And so union people feel like there was NAFTA, and anyway, what else have they done to try to help unions? Now there's exceptions to that, of course, but as a general rule, I think that's a fair critique that we've not done enough to fight back and re-level the playing field between workers and management.
And I think what Mary Clark is saying, I think is also a piece. I think that, who is the enemy? Working class people, it's, probably, it's not the Democrats. Like the common enemy are those big businesses and the corporate folks that are, pulling the strings. And I think that's something we'll probably talk a little bit about is, what's a winning message? And it's not to maybe pit each other against each other by racial demographics. There's a common enemy and it's not each other.
Absolutely. And again, the Sum of Us by Heather McGhee is such a great investigation into that, a really deep investigation.
I'm gonna read that.
Somebody had asked me in the chat, so I just want to make sure everyone knows that we'll be sending out the recording to registrants afterwards in case people weren't able to come tonight after registering, and you can share that with your groups as well. And I'll post in the chat the link to register for next week again.
Well, we've really enjoyed it and hope you all have too, and hope that most of you can come back, maybe all of you, and feel free to spread the word and share the recording so we might get a few of your colleagues in this as well.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Lauren, for hosting us.
Yes,
Thank you so much for coming tonight. And I saw some new names and faces on this, and I think that folks were excited to come see you. So for those who are new with Rural Power Lab programming tonight, please join us again. And of course, please join next week. And Cynthia, Anthony, Erica, thank you so much for your time and your expertise tonight. I'm excited to see what content we get to next week as well. And we'll make sure everybody has all the follow-up materials so they can get briefed if they want to watch the earlier one before joining.
Great,
Well, I think I will
Sounds
stop
good.
recording then.
great.
Thanks so much. Good night, everyone.
Yeah.
Yes, night. Bye-bye.
Thank you.